First, to give you a little context, how UCS has been approaching this issue over the years. Second, to talk about the politics of resilience and climate risk in the United States. And third, what the Obama administration is doing. So for Union of Concerned Scientists, this is not a new issue. We started engaging on this issue back in the late 1980s with the formation of the IPCC, and then going into the Rio Earth Summit talks. We were deeply engaged in the first national climate risk assessment that was done under the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s. When George W. Bush took office, one of the first things he did at the behest of the fossil fuel industry was to pull down the national risk assessment off the government websites and to prohibit the agencies from producing an updated version as he was required to do under law. So the Bush administration and their friends in industry clearly understood even back then the political power of risk assessment, of people becoming aware of impacts and costs of inaction in terms of building pressure on policymakers to take action and mitigation. So this notion that adaptation and mitigation are essentially in conflict with each other is just wrong. It's exactly the reverse, that once policymakers and constituencies start to understand the implications of climate change and the costs of inaction, they become much more sophisticated proponents of mitigation strategies. So when President Bush took the US out of the business of doing reassessments, we decided we had to step in. And we did work with regional teams of scientists and state governments around the country to produce a series of climate impact reports in the first decade of 2000. So we started with California, then we did the Great Lakes states, then we did the Gulf Coast states, then we did the Northeast. And just to give you an example of the impact these kind of things had, in California, when we pulled together a team of scientists to brief Governor Schwarzenegger about the difference between a business as usual scenario and an aggressive mitigation scenario, and he could see that in the business as usual scenario, California would lose 90% of the Sierra snowpack, he immediately got it. This is not just an environmental issue, it's an economic security and way of life issue for California, because if the Sierra snowpack goes away, as it is recently in recent seasons, the whole water structure and irrigation and agricultural structure of California starts to break down. So that is what led Governor Schwarzenegger to become the proponent of the most aggressive state-level policy, AB 32, in the United States. We have been working with the World Resources Institute, the Meridian Institute, and other organizations to build a network of state and local officials, academics, engineers, other experts across the country called the Climate Impacts Collaborative, which now has over 500 people as part of it. And we've been working with them to publicize the impacts, help deal with planning and what you can do at the local level, and also to give them a sense that they're in this together, to build a nationwide network of practitioners, eventually to start to build political pressure up the system to Congress and the administration. We've done a series of topical reports in recent years. Go on our website, which is ucsusa.org, and you can find them all there. I'll just give you a flavor of them with a few of the headlines. Encroaching tides, playing with fire, national landmarks at risk, rethinking flood insurance in a world of rising seas, heat in the heartland, and climate change in your health, rising temperatures, worsening ozone pollution. Each of this is designed to give concrete information to people in those sectors about what the implications of climate change are going to be for them, and actionable intelligence on how they can move forward to deal with those impacts. We've been working with members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, to look at disaster relief assistance reform, to look at federal programs to help local communities deal with the impacts of climate change. And I would say, in total contrast to the debate on mitigation and things like the Clean Power Plan, which Vicki and I are also deeply engaged in, it's a whole different conversation when you're talking about local impacts, resilience, infrastructure, et cetera. It's a much more open door. The ideological blinders drop away, and you can have intelligent conversations that go beyond, I am not a scientist, on the Republican side. So that's the good news. It's an entry point for a conversation there. Now, just to talk about the politics of this, if you look at the demographics of the US and who's most concerned about these issues, it's younger voters, it's independents, it's women, and it's Hispanics. It turns out Hispanics are the most aware and concerned about climate impacts and climate risks of any of the demographic subgroups in the US. And so if you're in the Republican Party and you're a pollster or a political advisor looking down the road, This starts to look a lot like gay marriage or immigration, where you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You don't want your candidate to be seen as anti-science, anti-reality. This is almost, for some demographics, a disqualifying issue if you take a stance that's sort of in line with the Koch brothers, the Tea Party, denying the reality of the problem. So that's starting to have some very interesting effects in US politics. We're planning a forum in Hampton, New Hampshire in October with partners up there to bring over 100 elected officials, both Republicans and Democrats, local elected officials, to New Hampshire from coastal states to talk about what they are experiencing with sea level rise, coastal flooding, and other impacts of climate change, and to share strategies, and of course to try to publicize that heavily in the first primary state in the presidential election cycle next year. So that when candidates come through New Hampshire after that forum, they will be asked, if you are elected president, what will you do to help the mayors and elected officials across the country who are coping with the reality of climate change? It's going to look pretty stupid if they say, I am not a scientist and I don't think the problem's real, in response to that question. So that is part of our strategy, is to, in a nonpartisan way, politicize the resilience issue and make it something that anyone who aspires to higher office has to have an intelligence response to. I should say the business community is also increasingly engaged. The Risky Business Report that came out last year, which looks at the range of consequences for each region of the US and each economic sector in the US, is changing the conversation in business. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions has also done very good work here, working with major multinationals about the business supply chain risk of climate change. And I think that's starting to change the perception in the business community, where traditionally you've had the large fossil fuel industry, the oil, the coal, the utilities, the railroads on one side, up against the very small renewable energy companies and a handful of others. And most of business is sort of sitting on the sidelines saying, we don't have a dog in this fight. What's our stake in it? Now they're starting to realize that climate impacts can be a fundamental risk to their business model, and that they do have a stake in this fight. And that's changing the politics over time as well. Finally, I'll just say a few things about the Obama administration. To their credit, they got this. The president got this, his advisors got this when they came into office, and they turned the on switch back on in terms of risk assessment and climate vulnerability with an executive order, and when he first came into office, directing all agencies to take steps to make it easier for communities to strengthen their resilience to extreme weather. Working with climate change adaptation plans for each major agency of government. How is climate change going to affect them? So the National Park Service, the Forest Service, NOAA, the Coast Guard, everyone had to start looking at this and figure out how were they going to build these threats into their strategic planning and their operations over time. He created a state, local, and tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness and resilience that issued a report last November to the federal government with a specific range of recommendations on how to incorporate climate change resilience policies into the federal regime, to remove barriers to community resilience, and to provide tools to local communities about how to grapple with this problem. He held a summit, the White House held a summit this past spring on climate change and public health with the Surgeon General of the United States there, and the Medical Association, the nurses and public health officials from across the country. And they just released this past week a Climate Services for Resilient Development report with the United Kingdom, with Google, with a number of other partners, the Red Cross and others, talking about how to help build in resilience to communities in developing countries and provide some of the benefits of the platforms and the data that we've developed there. And there's more to come. I mean, they're literally looking for new ideas about what they can do to get this discussion into the public space. Whenever the president goes out, you will see him talking about this issue, as he did at the Coast Guard commencement ceremony a couple of weeks ago, about the implications of climate change, or going down to the Everglades and talking about the implications for Florida's Everglades of climate change. So they are really on fire on this issue, and going to keep pressing until the last day they're in office to make sure this is part of the national conversation.